So just moving on to formal welcoming information that I want to share with you. The reason why we reached out as SPI to FES and at the beginning of the year and talked about the need to undertake further research in what many sometimes describe as being an overly researched area, and then to have these webinars and discussions, is that we feel very troubled by the fact that, notwithstanding the fact that we as SPI have been undertaking research into the field of poverty and inequality these past 15 years, we often get the sense that policymakers are deaf to the empirical evidence that we develop and put before them, and hence the need to actually broaden out and to bring on board other activists in other spaces who are able to take up and use the data to advance struggles in different spaces. And so it's a great pleasure that we have today our partners Telkom and also the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation, who have been working with us on basic income guarantee in different spaces. We're also very privileged that Nedlac Community Constituency is co-hosting with us. SPI has been an active member of Community Constituency for many years, and we, as a constituency, were the ones that raised the basic income grant when we started our work 6 years ago on comprehensive social security. And we'll continue with our dying breath to fight for that. But just to reflect briefly on the context in which we're having these webinars, we are at the tail end of the just after the sort of first year of the impact of COVID-19 on our country. And we know that that's exacerbated many of the divisions that exist, not least of all the digital divisions that exist between those who are able to operate with social distancing and using digital devices and those who not. But in addition to that, South Africa is a country that's characterized by gross poverty, inequality, and destitution. Our official unemployment rates the broader unemployment is sitting at 44.4%. We know that for the youth, the broader definition of unemployment between 24 and 35-year-olds is 76% and high amongst all age categories. So you cannot isolate and say this is an age cohort, which is not cruelly affected by unemployment. Unemployment being the main way in which the majority of us are able to access income. So for the majority of people in South Africa, 1 in 2 live below the upper bound poverty line, 1 in 4 live below the starvation line. And that was using 2015 figures, well before the impact of COVID-19. We've been seeing through the NIDS-CRAM data the huge spike in hunger and starvation, in particular the impact on women, as mothers tend to shield their children and older people from the worst ravages of hunger, therefore themselves being cruelly affected by hunger and starvation, and how this impacts directly on mental health. We saw in the July 2021 violent protests in South Africa, a number of people undertaking activities that spoke of a desperation, but also a lack of connection into a hopeful future, the destruction and self-destruction that comes with the inability to imagine a different future. One of the things that we've seen in South Africa in terms of recent policy responses to the COVID-19 epidemic has been the introduction of the 350 Rand per month social relief of distress grant. This, although the amount is far too little and the extent of people, the eligibility is far too narrow, we as SPI were able to see as a positive indication of the fact that there are people within government, and many of them we work with on a regular basis, who are able to see the need to respond to people's destitution, to break down those policy barriers that had hitherto existed, such as no extension of social income to working age people because of the legacy of the ways in which our social policy and social security policy has been defined. And the question is how we are able to proceed to capture that, both in terms of our research, but also in terms of our political engagements and advocacy. So without turning this into an analysis of what we are and should be doing, We're here to celebrate through the launch of Nkululeko Majozi as the lead author, a research paper in which we aspire able to contribute to the policy debate and discussion around the possibility of disrupting the levels of economic exclusion by advancing the call for an inclusive, universal basic income guarantee linked to the upper bound poverty line of 1,335 Rand. In fact, this very paper is a result of many of our early engagements when people said, but maybe we should be piloting this ourselves. And we were able to point out that a fair number of pilots have been done globally over the last 20 years with increasing regularity. And we pointed out that because of the urgency of our need for intervention, but also because of the costs of piloting, we should learn from the lessons that have been learned globally. And so, in essence, this research paper is that it's an exposition of the pilots that have been undertaken and an attempt to synthesize and summarize how the findings of those pilots could better inform the design of a universal basic income guarantee scheme in South Africa. Last week was the first of our 3 webinar series, and that was a paper that was delivered by Duba Kabule, which was There we go. I was unmuted, and I think Herbert has been muted. Yes. And that was, so Duba's paper was an overview of the social assistance history and what a basic income guarantee would cost and what it would mean in terms of multipliers as well as economic growth. And this paper will, as I said, indicate and share the findings of pilots, including from our very own neighbors. So I am going to hand over to Mbuso. I just do want to particularly thank, of course, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for the partnership that is so important. And I want to particularly also thank the SPI team, which is Probile, Nkululeko, Lindy K, Tina Mpo, Michaela Duduzo, and Angelo. And the great thing is, like with each webinar, we add people to our team because people are just so excited about being able to work on matters such as basic income grant. And then we as SPI will be launching non-partisan, is the way it's now described, websites in coming days around the theme of basic income grant or basic income guarantee for a better South Africa. And you can, on that website, we will be hosting not only this and other people's research, but also really exciting numbers of testimonies that are coming in on a daily basis from ordinary people about how they could imagine their lives being transformed by the introduction of a basic income guarantee. So thank you to all, welcome to all. And I now hand over to Dr. Moyo, Mbuso Moyo. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isobel and the research team at SPI for organizing this important webinar. I guess you can hear me. And a big thank you to my colleagues at FES, Uta Dixon and Abnavin King, for supporting the work that we do with SPI. On behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the FES, I greet and welcome all of you to this webinar. We really consider our partnership with SPI as strategically important, for we believe, as SPI does, that building an inclusive society in South Africa must primarily concern itself with uprooting the root causes of poverty and inequality and their manifestations, really. We do have work that is done by government through the social wedge, which involves the provision of free primary health care, no fee paying school, social protection, RDP housing, and the provision of free basic services such as water, electricity, and sanitation to poor households, which is one of the government's poverty reduction levers. However, we still have a lot of unemployed working age people who do not have access to social assistance, and they remain vulnerable to abject poverty. Just as a way of giving some background statistics, according to Stats SA, report, which was published in 2017, entitled Poverty Trends in South Africa, an examination of absolute poverty between 2006 and 2015. 55% or over 30.4 million South Africans were living in poverty in 2015. In another study by Ronak and et al., which is entitled The Labor Market and Poverty Impacts of COVID-19 in South Africa, which was published in 2020, about 20% and 33% of job losers, which is approximately 1.7 million individuals, fell into poverty as a result of COVID-19 related job loss. Using an estimate of the dependence ratio of job losers, these authors projected that these job losses associated with an increase in overall poverty of between 3 to 5.5 million people, including their dependents. This is equivalent to 5% or 10% of the total population in South Africa. What one then realizes is that COVID-19 has exacerbated an already dire situation of poverty in South Africa. Thus, the destitution that is visited upon a vast swath of South African population has renewed calls for the implementation of a basic income grant. As the FES, we support this call, and we have thus partnered with the SPI in commissioning 3 papers which look into the necessity and possibility of implementing a BIG in South Africa. Last week's webinar discussed a paper written by Duma Gqubule, as Isobel has already indicated, which is entitled A Basic Income Guarantee for a Better South Africa, the Evolution of Social Assistance in South Africa after 1994. This paper makes a fundamental argument, in my view, in that a BIG is not just a means for fighting poverty and reducing inequality. It is an economic stimulus that increases the purchasing power of a population through a direct unconditional cash transfers to individuals in society. I want to believe that this paper really overturns the common neoliberal argument that a basic income grant is not affordable. It does so, in my view, by outlining and critically evaluating the different models that the South African state can use to fund a BIG. Today's webinar discusses a paper written by Nkululeko Majozi and looks at the global basic income grant pilot since the year 2000, with a view to draw lessons for South Africa. This and last week's paper, in my view, are methodologically sound, and they offer substantiated arguments and proposals on why it is important to implement a BIG in South Africa and how to do so. So they do not simply advocate the adoption of BIG. They show how it is feasible in fiscal terms. I believe this is important because there is always an immediate backlash from those who are disinclined to the BIG when we speak about implementing this program. So I would like to describe these papers as an arrow indeed in the quiver of those who seek to fight against the common tropes that are used to oppose the implementation of a BIG, such as that it discourages people to seek for employment and breeds a culture of laziness and dependence on states' handouts. I thus invite you to listen to the wisdom that would come from the paper being discussed today. And I thank you for taking the time to be here. Thank you very much, Isobel.
All right. Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Dr. Moyo. And thank you to SPI for inviting the Human Rights Commission to facilitate this webinar today. Good day, everybody. And also thank you for your important work on the BIG. So today I have the honor of introducing the speakers. Let me begin by introducing the main speaker and the primary author of the report, Mr. Nkululeko Madjozi. Nkululeko Madjozi is a social security researcher at SPI, responsible for driving SPI's research into social protection, particularly social security and basic income. His focus is on advancing knowledge and progressive realization of social security, and also participating in research to support social justice advocacy and campaigning into initiatives both locally and globally. Prior to joining SPI, Nkululeko worked as a doctoral researcher in the Office of the Executive Director at the African Institute of South Africa, AISA, in the Human Sciences Research Council, HSRC, where his work entailed providing research and evidence-based policy advice on governance, peace and security issues to African governments and multilateral organizations operating in Africa. He has also served as the assistant editor of Africa Insight, AISA's well-renowned international scientific journal. Nkululeko holds a Master of Security Studies degree from the University of Pretoria and is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Development Studies at the University of South Africa. Thank you, Nkululeko. You may begin.
Thank you very much, Netemba, for the introduction. Let me start by acknowledging our director, Isabel Fry, and also from the FES, Dr. Mbuso Moyo, for providing the funding for this research. We're truly grateful. Before I start, let me also acknowledge the presence of my co-author on this paper, Lihlono Lokekana, who's no longer with us at SPI. Yeah. Okay, so the presentation is quite a lengthy one, so I'll just get into it. If I can just share my screen quickly. I hope everyone can see the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation. So the paper I'm presenting on today, as it has already been alluded to, is titled Global Basic Income Grant Pilots Since the Year 2000, an annotated summary of lessons for South Africa. So just to say a bit about the paper, this paper builds on SPI's 2021 research report reviewing social transfer programs within the SADC region and global social protection responses to COVID-19. SPI's SADC report sought to consolidate existing knowledge of BIG pilots and the policy formation dynamics for social protection policies within the SADC region in order to argue for a launch of these programs. But now, with this study, what we sought to do is to present an annotated summary of lessons from BIG pilot projects that have been implemented globally since the year 2000 of the potential transformational socio-economic impact of a BIG in South Africa. And these lessons we will use to inform and advance the research, policy, and social dialogue for the implementation of a BIG in South Africa. So just to demarcate the scope of the paper, so this paper is exclusively limited to the impact, or the focus of the paper is exclusively limited to the impact of the basic income grant on the lives, well-being, and work activities of the participants involved in the selected BIG experiments. So this means the paper does not delve into any analysis of possible fiscal and monetary policy implications of a BIG in South Africa. So that falls under the scope of the papers that were written by Duma Kubule. The first one which was presented last week. Now, I won't go through this because I think Dr. Moyo and Isabel have provided a nice background to what informs the rationale for this paper. But just to emphasize that people of working age in South Africa have been sort of left out without any sort of social assistance, which then makes them the most vulnerable citizens of our country. So that's where now the long-standing call for a BIG in South Africa comes in. And in response to these calls for the implementation of a BIG in South Africa, SPI has undertaken research to explore the key lessons from BIG product pilots carried out across the globe since the year 2000 to inform the research, policy, and social debate into the practicality and viability of a BIG in South Africa. So this is the main aim of this paper, or of our projects on the BIG. So just to go through the methodology and selection criteria of the selected cases that we looked at in this paper. So the paper was a desktop research study utilizing a cross-sectional analysis of BIG pilot projects implemented since the year 2000. And the aim was to draw out key lessons of the potential transformational socioeconomic impact of a BIG that can be used to advocate for the BIG, for the implementation of a BIG in South Africa. Now, there have been several BIG pilot experiments conducted across the world since the turn of the century, aimed at testing the impacts and or implications of a BIG on poverty and inequality and overall human well-being. Now, the cases that we have selected for this paper are 6 cases, and we drew them both from developed country BIG pilots and also developing country BIG pilots. And these are the Canada BIG in Ontario, the United States BIG pilot in California, the Spain Barcelona BIG, and also the Indian Madhya Pradesh BIG pilots. Oh, sorry about that. And then the Namibian BIG pilots in Ochivero Omidara, and the Kenyan pilot in the region of Rarieda. So the selected cases highlight the impact or implications of a BIG on 5 main socioeconomic issues. The first one being women empowerment, health and nutrition, food security, income and incentive to work, as well as self-worth and well-being. So why did we select the cases that we selected? Well, the Canadian City of Ontario BIG pilot highlights the impact of a BIG on the overall well-being of individuals in low-income communities within the context of a high-income country. The USA pilot in Stockton, highlights the impact of a BIG on the mental health of youth in economically disadvantaged positions due to wage stagnation, staggering wealth, and income inequality coupled with the student debt crisis. The Spanish B-Income pilot highlights the efficiency of the use of a BIG within an innovative policy that combines a cash transfer with policies aimed at curbing social exclusion and improving employment opportunities through the provision of community development and entrepreneurial training. And then the 2 Indian pilots in Madhya Pradesh highlight the positive impact of a BIG on the social inclusion and financial empowerment of disabled people within households. Whilst the Namibian Ochivero pilot highlights the positive impact of a BIG on women's financial independence and sexual freedom, as well as the reduction of crime rates. And lastly, Kenya's Give Directly pilot in the region of Rarieda highlights the differences in treatment impact of once-off large sum BIG transfers versus small monthly apportioned BIG transfers. So moving on into the comparative metrics. So each pilot was evaluated in the paper according to the following criteria. The first one being the socio-economic context, that is the social standing of the individuals or communities targeted by the pilots, often measured as a combination of the levels of education, income, and occupation, etc. The second matrix being the distribution mechanism of the proposed BIG was pivotal in this analysis as it shed light on the best practices for the operationalization and distribution of basic income to recipients. And since there are multiple versions of a BIG, now you will note I haven't been using the word universal BIG. I've just been referring to a BIG. So when you survey the literature on the BIG, you find that there are multiple versions of a BIG, namely universal, conditional, and unconditional. So it was of paramount importance to explore which version of the BIG was implemented in these pilots in order to test its practicality. And the results and impacts of the pilots were analyzed against SPI's definition of a BIG adopted from the Basic Income Ed Network. So now, when defining the BIG in this paper, we find that the concept is a highly contested concept. And then when one surveys the literature, there's a tendency to define the BIG in three distinct ways. First being universal, which refers to a BIG that is automatically available to everyone, including adults and children. Second being unconditional, referring to a BIG that does not require any compliance measures, but is targeted or means tested, that is targeted at specific groups of the population below a certain income threshold, for example. And then it's conditional, referring to a BIG that is means tested. Now, for the cases that we have selected, of the 6 cases that we've selected, only one case, the Indian BIG, falls under the category of a universal BIG, as a basic income grant in this case was automatically available to all registered participants. That is every adult, individual, and child in the selected areas without regard to socioeconomic status and compliance measures. Similarly, the Nigerian and Kenyan pilots were the only unconditional BIG case studies, as the monthly payments did not come with any compliance measures, but they were targeted though. So for example, the Namibian case, the BIG was paid to all residents in Otjivoro or Midara below the age of 60, whilst for Kenya, the cash transfers were distributed on a household basis rather than an individual basis. And the 3 remaining cases, which all are from the developed world, fall under the category of a conditional BIG, as they were all means tested. That is, participants in the BIGs had to be from a low income household living below a specific income level. Now, SPI has always called for a universal BIG in the form of a monthly cash transfer that is unconditional and permanent and paid to all individuals in society. And this refers to a BIG that is without means testing and compliance requirements and covers all citizens and residents with permits, as well as recognized refugees and asylum seekers. And SPI's position follows Obin's definition of a BIG as a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means testing or work requirement. So the cases that we selected for this paper were tested against this definition of a BIG. Okay, I'll skip that. So to get into the meat of the presentation now. So the first pilot project we looked at was Canada's Ontario BIG pilot. And we considered the socio-economic context that necessitated the pilot. And what we found was that Canada experimented with the BIG pilot in the province of Ontario in the cities of Hamilton, Thunder Bay, and Lindsay. The pilot was first announced in 2017, and participants were selected and enrolled by 2018, so within a year. And then, in these cities, the cities are characterized by many low-income households where poverty is linked with inequality, especially for women, minority groups, and persons with disabilities. Thus, the aim of the pilot was to create a new and viable approach to reducing poverty sustainably through a basic income transfer. In terms of the type of BIG it was, the basic income was conditional. It was only made available to individuals who were between the ages of 18 to 64, living in low-income households. And in terms of the distribution of the cash transfer, there were two groups in this experiment, and those chosen to receive a monthly income for a period of 3 years, and a control group that did not receive any payment. Now, a total of 4,000 participants were selected to receive the BIG, whilst 2,000 individuals were selected to be part of the control group. Single individuals received an amount of $16,000 or almost $17,000, less any of earned income, whilst couples were receiving about $24,000, less any combined earned income, 50% of any combined earned income. In the case where participants were receiving other forms of social transfers, such as the Ontario Works or disability transfers, it was substituted by the basic income grant. Now, from the reports that we read on this pilot project, it was observed that participants were healthier upon receiving the BIG transfer. They were in good spirits and continued working to supplement the cash transfers they were receiving. The recipients of the grant also reported improvements in their physical and mental health, labor market participation, food security, housing stability, financial status, and social relationships. It was also reported that healthcare services were less burdened, as there were less frequent visits to hospitals and health practitioners. So with the BIG providing that food security for people and providing them with that money to be able to take care of themselves, people were more healthier. And now to move on to the USA Stockton, California basic income pilot. So this pilot was officially known as the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration Seed, which was first launched in February 2019, targeting 125 Stocktonians to receive about $500, which is approximately 7,000 rands every month for 2 years. From the 125 participants, 25 were selected to share their experiences with the pilot. And then additional 200 participants were selected to be part of the control group. And both groups were made up of 69% women. So in terms of the socio-economic context in Stockton, it's a place where economic pressures are felt most by the youth, who are at risk of being more economically disadvantaged than their parents. This is largely due to a persistent wage stagnation, is a staggering wealth and income inequality coupled with a student debt crisis. And the aim of the pilot was to track the impact of having a basic income grant on the mental health of the recipients to changes in income volatility. In terms of the distribution mechanism for the grants, it was administered through a prepaid debit card that was provided in partnership with the nonprofit community financial resources service provider. The prepaid card were registered in each participant's name, so it was distributed individually. And the key findings from the report are that the money was used by the recipients to improve the overall quality of life, as most recipients spent the money on basic needs, such as paying for bills and supplementing monthly groceries. Other participants, Other participants felt less pressure in terms of stressing over the lack of resources. And with regards to work, participants were not dissuaded by the income they were receiving to stop participating in the labor market. Instead, some of the participants were encouraged to develop side hustles by the entrepreneurial spirit ignited by the basic income grant. And we've also seen this with our own SRD grant here in South Africa. So the Spanish B income pilots, in terms of the socio-economic context, as a result of the 2008 economic crisis, Spain experienced a rise in poverty triggered by the rise in unemployment and evictions due to people struggling to keep up with their mortgages and rent. This led to a rise in homelessness and illegal squatting on evicted properties. People also experienced precarious employment. It's said that 10% of the population in Barcelona by 2018 were working jobs that earn them salaries below the poverty line. In response to the above mentioned socioeconomic issues, Spain implemented an EU-funded 2-year basic income grant pilots in deprived urban areas of Barcelona, starting in October 2017 to the end of July 2019. And now the aim of the pilot was to fight poverty and social exclusion, as well as to test the efficacy and efficiency of what they call an innovative and integral policy that combines a cash transfer with policies of social and employment opportunities. 2,000 households were selected to participate and divided into 2 equal groups. One group received the basic income and the other group served as a control group to measure the BIG's effectiveness against existing social cash transfer policies. Included also in the pilot was inclusion activities that were intended to equip people with entrepreneurial skills, focusing on different areas of the social economy. In particular, a 12-month training program that was accompanied by an employment plan targeting unemployment individuals of working age in 150 households was implemented. And also in addition to this, there was a social economy program that offered to help 100 households in creating community projects. A housing renovation program was designed to help 100 households to increase their incomes through renting rooms. So this was also a conditional BIG pilot, which sought to provide income to households where at least one member of the household is of working age and has income below the minimum threshold. Participants had to be registered in Barcelona and be a resident of one of the selected areas of Aix Bezos and commit to stay there until the end of the project. In terms of its distribution, the municipality put into trial a municipal inclusion support payment system that was administered through a new local social currency to promote local commerce and to strengthen community ties. This was a digital currency distinct from euros, which can be accessed via mobile apps or a card with a QR code. The MIS is also a social emergency benefit that supplements the income of individuals within a single household. The basic income threshold is then derived from this benefit, and it is calculated as the sum of basic needs and housing needs. So the key findings from the surveys conducted, it was found that the pilot improved the overall well-being of individuals in terms of general satisfaction with life and its determining factors. In terms of work placement or other dimensions related to employment, no significant results were observed. And the report goes on to suggest that these results were expected since participants were experiencing a high degree of job precariousness before the commencement of the pilot. And so, according to the authors of the report, it was unrealistic to expect results in this context. And it was also found that women represented a larger cohort of participants, with 56% being represented in the study, while men represented 44% of the cohort. And the dominant representation of females in the study, according to the report, was due to the fact that women are always seeking assistance at social services centers. And as a consequence, the pilots regarded women as default contact persons in each household. Now, to move on to the pilots in the developing countries, in terms of the Indian pilots, these were prompted by the contentious political debate in India regarding the potential of unconditional cash transfers to alleviate poverty among the country's poor. And at the time, India did not have any cash transfer programs. It only had social security programs, or the social security programs were characterized by the public distribution system, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, and other social services such as the public health system and education system. But despite this, 30% of India's population was still affected by hunger and poverty. So in terms of the design of the projects, of the pilots themselves, because there were 2 pilots in India. UNICEF launched and funded the pilots in order to test the efficacy of a basic income grant in alleviating poverty among India's poor populations. And the 2 pilots were carried out in Madhya Pradesh, which is India's rural and 5th largest state by population, with 72 million residents. And also SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, acted as a facilitator of the project. The first project was known as the Madhya Pradesh Unconditional Cash Transfer, and the second was the Tribal Village Unconditional Cash Transfer. The MPUCT involved 20 villages that were divided into 2 groups. So this was a much bigger pilot project. The first group comprised of 8 villages where every man and woman received an initial unconditional cash transfer of 200 rupees, and each child received 100 rupees through their mother or registered guardian. These amounts were increased to 300 and 150 rupees per month, respectively, a year later. And the second group was made up of 12 villages that acted as control villages and didn't receive any cash transfers. The MPUCT ran for 18 months and covered 6,000 people who received the cash transfers, whilst the TVUCT only involved 2 tribal villages. 1 village received the monthly cash transfer of 300 and 150 rupees per child and adult, respectively, for a period of 12 months, whilst the other village acted as the control village and did not receive any cash transfers. So yeah, there were 3 aims to the pilots. The first one was to identify the effects of a basic income on individual and family behavior and attitudes. The second being to identify the effects of basic income on community development. And lastly, to test whether basic income grants would work better if implemented through a voice organization, SEWA, that would presumably give members of the community the capacity to act in unison. So yeah, as alluded to earlier, this was a universal BIG project. The cash transfers in both pilots were offered on a universal basis without targeting certain groups of people. And in terms of being the distribution, the cash transfers were distributed on an individual basis. Every participant in the project was required to open an account within the first 3 months of the project. And that account was then used to transfer their funds directly to them, thus giving them greater financial autonomy and ensuring greater financial inclusion than where transfers are paid to household or head of household. And this proved to be especially beneficial to women and people with disabilities. So in terms of the findings, there was a marked improvement in nutrition and diet amongst grants recipients. This was especially true for young girls whose age to weight underwent significant improvements. There was also an increase in food security, especially among the tribal villages, from 50% in the baseline census to 78% in the evaluation survey. In terms of health and healthcare, there was positive impact there as well. There were less incidents of common illnesses, with households attributing their improvement in health to a better nutrition and diet, and more spending on private healthcare. And the more spending on private healthcare was also an indication of India's poor healthcare system. In terms of labor, work, and productivity, there was a reported increase in labor and productivity amongst the participants in the cash transfer households as compared to control villages. In particular, there's a reported increased move towards more entrepreneurial activity and self-employed work amongst cash transfer recipients. This is especially true amongst women, who made more investments towards small production items such as sewing machines, seeds, fertilizer, and livestock. And in terms of incomes, both pilots found that cash transfer recipients' households were more likely to increase their income from work. And in particular, there was positive impacts for disabled people than other people, or than other groups of people in the pilot projects. And this is because the grant allowed disabled people within households to have a better say on how money is spent in the household. So to move on to the Namibian project. As you know, Namibia is similar to South Africa. It's a product of colonialism and racial apartheid. And in the post-independence era, the majority of Namibians have found themselves in a state of vulnerability due to the country's high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So the aims of the BIG pilot in Otjivero Omidara was firstly to pilot the Namibian government's NEMTEX, which is the equivalent of SARS in Namibia, recommendation of a universal BIG for all citizens of Namibia. The second objective was to investigate whether the introduction of a BIG would prompt people away from the labor market. As we know, there's this whole myth that a BIG would induce laziness and result in people choosing not to work, or whether it would do the opposite and facilitate people's efforts to find work or create their own work opportunities. And of course, this one was also a targeted BIG, as the people that received the monthly cash transfers were people under the age of 60. And in terms of it, but it wasn't distributed with any conditions. In terms of the distribution mechanism, for the first 6 months, it was the BIG was distributed as a direct cash transfer to every individual recipient at a designated cash payout, like we used to do here in South Africa. This process was also managed by a private company. Okay, I can skip that. But after 6 months of using this process, the company was decommissioned and the grants were moved to the Namibian Post Office, where the grants would now be paid into a NemPost Smart Card savings account. Now, in terms of the findings, we find that the introduction of the BIG led to a significant drop in poverty. Prior to the introduction of the BIG, 76% residents of Otjivero Omidara were classified as living under the food poverty line of 152 Namibian dollars per month. And that number dropped significantly to 37% within a short period of a year. And in terms of economic activity, the introduction of the BIG led to an overall increase in economic activity, including increases in employment from both wage work and increased entrepreneurial or self-employment activity. There was an 11% increase in the employment rate for both those working for pay or for profit. And it increased from, income increased from 44% to 55% as people established small businesses such as tuck shops, brick making, baking, sewing, and dressmaking. In terms of healthcare, there was a reduction in child malnutrition. Before the implementation of the BIG, there was 42% of the children were found to be malnourished, with the majority, 82% of these children under the age of 3. However, after 6 months of the implementation of the BIG, the malnourishment rate dropped from 42% to 17%, and then it dropped also a year later to 10%. There was also a reduction in crime rates, with overall crime rates reported at the police station reduced by 42%. In particular, there was a significant decline in stock theft, as it decreased by 43%, whilst illegal hunting and trespassing declined by 95% from 20 reported cases to 1. And in particular with this pilot, there was a reduction in women's dependency on men for their survival, with the BIG empowering women by putting cash into their hands. The women gained a measure of control over their own sexuality and were freed to some extent from the pressure of engaging in transactional sex. So before the implementation of the BIG in Namibia, or in that community of Ochivero or Mitara, you found that women used to go to the local tavern or shebeen, and with the intention of drawing the attention of the men that are employed in the surrounding farms, who have the money and who get paid on a weekly basis. So to move on to the last pilot, the Kenyan pilots. So in terms of Kenya's socio-economic context, Kenya has the biggest economy in East Africa and the 4th biggest in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, I think I'll just skip over this for the interest of time. And just get into the design of the pilots. It was a randomized controlled trial carried out by Give Directly, the NGO group. And the pilot was carried out over a 2-year period between 2011 and 2013 among rural households in the villages of the region of Rarieda in the western part of Kenya. 126 villages were chosen to be part of the pilot and were divided in half of 63, so with 63 serving as the treatment group and the other half as the control group. 503 households in those groups were randomly selected to receive a temporary cash transfer of 25,200, which is roughly $404, whilst 432 households were randomly selected from the control group villages and did not receive any transfer. From the 503 treatment groups, 258 were assigned to receive the transfer on a monthly basis for a period of 9 months in installments of $45 per month. And the remaining 245 households were assigned to receive the cash transfers, which is $404 as a once-off lump sum. The transfers for both groups were made between 2011 and 2013. And for the lump sum group, a further 137 households were randomly selected to receive an additional $1,121 in 7 monthly installments beginning February 2012. This means now that the total number or the total transfer amount received by these households was $1,525. So the overall aim of the Kenyan BIG pilot was to measure the impact of the organization's unconditional transfer program on poor rural households' economic and psychological well-being. And in terms of distribution mechanism, M-Pesa, which is the famous Kenyan mobile money system, was utilized. So in terms of the findings, The study reported a positive impact on self-employment activities and earnings from treatment group households relative to control group households. There was also a notable monthly increased investment in non-agricultural business activities and livestock. You'll remember that Kenya is a largely agricultural country. In terms of food security, the cash transfers were mostly impactful among monthly recipients than large lump sum recipients. Monthly recipients were found to be more likely to spend on current consumption goods such as food than expensive durable goods such as metal roofs and furniture on account. In terms of female empowerment, there was an increase in female empowerment at the village level due to the cash transfers. And this was especially so amongst the large lump sum households compared to the monthly recipients. And also there was positive impacts on psychological well-being, especially of the treatment households. There were some small nuances though linked to large sum transfers and gendered recipient households. Increases in psychological well-being were found to be larger in large lump sum recipient households than in monthly recipient households, while a greater reduction in worries and a greater increase in self-esteem was recorded in female recipient households than in male recipient households. So this means there was a correlation between large lump sum recipient households and psychological well-being, as well as between female empowerment and psychological well-being. So in terms of our analysis now as SPI of the findings of all of these 6 BIG pilots, is that we find that there are lessons, all of these BIG pilots carry valuable lessons that can inform the research policy and social dialogue around the implementation of a BIG in South Africa. And as stated before, these lessons cover the 5 main treatment impact matrices, which are women empowerment, health and nutrition, food security, income and incentive to work, and self-worth and well-being. What we found is that the major takeaway lesson from the pilot studies for South Africa is the significant positive outcomes for women empowerment, witnessed particularly in the developing country BIG pilots. And this was mainly due to the increased levels of financial independence among women provided by the BIG cash transfers, resulting in a significant reduction in women's economic dependence on men. And this further translates to women having greater control over their lives and bodies, which is a very pertinent issue in the South African context, where structural socio-economic differentials create and perpetuate the vulnerability of women to gender-based violence. The findings also reflect that BIG cash transfers have increased positive effects on levels of labor market participation and self-employment activities, especially for women. And this goes against the well-documented myth that a BIG would disincentivize work and breed a culture of laziness and dependence on state handouts. This finding also bodes well for countries such as South Africa, which is characterized by structural unemployment and the inability of the economy to produce enough jobs for new labor market entrants. And furthermore, the paper also finds that there are positive outcomes on the physical and mental health of BIG participants in these pilots. And this is linked to better nutrition and diets, correlating with an increased ability to spend on food afforded by the BIG. And this increase in food security is also associated with decreased levels of stress and anxiety over running out of money for food mid-month. And it's particularly relevant in our context here in South Africa, where hunger in food insecure households is the main driver behind child stunting, adult depression, and anxiety. And lastly, one of the findings, important findings coming out of these BIG pilots is the increased sense of dignity, self-worth, and well-being resulting from receiving a BIG. And this is especially crucial for us in our constitutional dispensation, where the state's obligation to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill South Africans' rights to dignity, equality, and freedom is seriously challenged and undermined by high rates of poverty and inequality among the majority of South Africans. Yeah, so I'll end off there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for providing us with such an insightful and important comparative analysis, Nkululeko. It's particularly important in our increasingly globalizing world. Let me then introduce the first respondent, Dr. Guillermo Delgado. Dr. Guillermo Delgado is an adjunct researcher at the Department of Land and Property Sciences and the coordinator of the Integrated Land Management Institute. He coordinates the team that revised the National Housing Program for the Ministry of Urban and Rural Development in Namibia, and currently leads the Urban Forum program at NUST. He has lectured courses on housing, land administration, urban development, and research methods. Born in Mexico, he holds an architecture degree from the Universidad Ibero-Mexicano in Mexico City, and a Master of Architecture from the Berlin Institute, now part of TU Delft, and a PhD in Architecture and Planning from the University of Cape Town. His work takes place through research, design, and cultural platforms with a focus on issues of land rights, housing, urbanization, and co-productive spatial practices. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Delgado.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. Otherwise, please let me know. Thank you, Nkululeko, for the presentation. I think it provides a good overview of what's happening in the planet with regards to basic income grant pilots. I think you presented also information that dismisses some of the common beliefs about the basic income grant. For example, that it enhances some form of or emphasizes dependency on the state, whereas we saw that the evidence shows that it reduces the reliance on the healthcare system and increases entrepreneurial activities. I also appreciate particularly I read the report, so I also appreciate how and mention on how these measures like this one realize the promises of democracy in South Africa or independence in Namibia. Like, for example, the Bill of Rights promises. I think you focused less on the unintended consequences of some of the pilots, and I suppose there were some setbacks or effects that might have not been intended, and it would have been good to hear a little bit more about them. But I have three questions that I would like to put to you. There's three kinds of modalities you can go of the basic income grant. You speak of universal, unconditional, and conditional. And considering that you focus on the impact, perhaps you already have a hunch or an idea of what would be more appropriate or adequate for the specific case of South Africa. And perhaps here you have to maybe take a step back, and for those who might not be very familiar with the situation in South Africa, perhaps do a very, very short sort of footnote to this. Another point is that, well, these experiments were aimed to test some kind of validity, no? I mean, there were as experiments do, they intended to test some hypotheses. Now we have the data and we have the evidence. Now my question is, what else do you think would be needed to advance the basic income grant agenda? Social forces putting pressure, grassroots activism. So let me know if you think what else is needed. This is also linked to a sort of sub-question. I mean, you mentioned that in some of them, on some of the pilots that you presented, there were also other, let's call it, flanking measures, in addition to the transfer of the cash grants. In some cases, it was a community program. In other, it was, I think, if I read correctly, even like a residential housing program. So, what else are the measures that you would deem flank or support well the implementation of the basic income? And my last question is perhaps a little bit tricky, but there are different experiments that have been implemented. What else do we need to find out? The cases that you present illustrate a variety of settings, some of them implemented in more urban, other ones in more rural settings. They present a variety of sizes and a variety of modalities. There's nuances to all of these factors, but what else would you say is the outstanding research agenda? Or like some of the grassroots activists would perhaps ask more directly, do we need more research? So that's my input. Congratulations again, and I hope that this is also widely circulated and accessible, and I'm sure it will contribute to the debate both in South Africa, Namibia, and all the partner places where this is an active discussion. Over to you.
Thanks, Guillermo. I think what we should do is to allow second respondent, Dr. Madalitso Phiri, to give us his inputs as well, and then I'll address all the questions, or both your questions and his questions afterwards. So I'll hand over back to Snetemba to introduce Madalitso. Thanks. Snetemba, are you still connected? All right. In that case, I think Snetemba has lost connection. In that case, may I please ask Dr. Nqobile Zulu to introduce the next speaker?
Thank you, Nkululeko. Thank you, Dr. Guillermo. The next respondent is just a minute, please. Is Madalitso Phiri. Madalitso. Madalitso Phiri is a critical Pan-African sociologist who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Johannesburg. At the Institute of Advanced Studies, JIS. He's a Malawian citizen in the South African permanent resident, with translational upbringing, having lived in Mozambique for over 10 years. He's currently working on a book manuscript, building on his doctoral dissertation, tentatively called The Color of Inequality in South Africa, making sense of transformative social policy. I think this is interesting that it also speaks to some of the pilots that Nkululeko has looked at, but also Brazil has been known for doing his PhD. And he's doing this under contract with Brill Academic Press. Phiri's publications include book chapters, refereed journal articles, and opinion pieces in the Monthly Review, the Palgrave Handbook on African Political Economy, the Journal of Southern African Studies, JSAS, Africa Insight, Innovation and Development, the South African Journal of International Affairs, the African Journal of Conflict Resolution, Black Agenda Review, and the Thinker. He pursues a research program that encompasses 3 complementary lines of inquiry: comparative social policy in South Africa and Brazil, race and the political economy of development in Africa, and Black political thought. He earned a Doctor of Philosophy in Sociology from the University of South Africa, UNISA, a Master of Philosophy MPhil in Development Studies, a Bachelor of Social Science Honors in International Relations, and a Bachelor of Social Science in Politics and Sociology. All from the University of Cape Town, UCT. He's also a 3-time fellow from 2014 to 2017 through the Next Generation of Social Science Africa, funded by the Social Science Research Council, New York, United States. He was previously a doctoral research fellow at the UNISA's the SI Sachi Chair in Social Policy, Victoria, South Africa. Prior to that, he worked as a researcher for the Human Sciences Research Council in Cape Town between 2011 and 2012. He is proficient in English and in his native Chichewa and competent in Portuguese. Dr. Phiri Muligwanji, over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. We know greetings to everyone. And thanks, Nkululeko, for extending the invitation to comment on the work. I really appreciate the work that's being done. Let me just get water. So on my side, what I'm gonna do based on the presentation that you've made, I'm going to, I have 4 critical points to make. But I also just wanted to to highlight something that is really substantial. Sorry, in terms of commending the work that's being done, considering that this is a comparative study that has focused on the developed and the developing world. Sometimes when we're looking at South Africa, we tend to think from this isolationist perspective, and this is so important that the cases that you picked, be it Kenya, Namibia, and in the global north, in Canada, the US, and Spain, are so important and pertinent. When we think about the rising inequalities, say in the US, this shows you like that these studies are important. They do not only touch on the dimensions that are focusing on the problems that we're facing in the global south, but these are global issues, so to speak. I think it confirms what the Comoros have actually highlighted, that there's this convergency that's taking place globally. And we need to develop theoretical and empirical tools or fortify what we already have so that we can actually inform a larger global audience. And I think your research speaks to those encounters and experiences and observations. I wanted to highlight a few things that are maybe useful in terms of going forward as we think through the implications of the adoption of universal, or I know you actually highlighted what the different terms or terminologies that you used. So I'll be using the specific one that you used to say that SPI advocates for a universal term. I think a major dimension that we need to problematize is the emphasis on social protection itself. And we know that part of the issue is that when we reduce social policy to social protection, it becomes a narrow vision of what social policy should actually be. This also pretty much jettisons some of the wider implications and ideas of what a comprehensive social policy should look like. So I would want you to maybe give us comments or suggestions in terms of how we should or we ought to understand the problematizations of the concept of social protection and leading to and the narrow definitions of what it really constitutes. Considering that the proposal for a basic income guarantee is a very radical idea. So can we actually understand that proposal within the narrow confines of social protection? I think what I'm trying to push us is the reflections that have actually been made by other African theorists on social policy, whose works you may know, whether it's Thandika Mkandawire and Jimmy Adeshina, who've made sense of these transformative social policies by adding the components of production, of redistribution, of national building and social cohesion, and not narrowly defining social protection as social policy. And I think we need to engage with some of these very organic ideas that inform a part and parcel of thinking from the position of the subalterns. The second dimension that I wanted to highlight, and this you can actually choose to take up, is just an observation of mine, or but feel free to rest with me on this one. So in the wider consideration of comparative studies, there's always a common question, and in terms of at least when people are presenting on comparative work, they'll say that, what is it that South Africa can learn from all these experiments, right, globally? And I think for me, that is a little bit limiting, right? In one sense, is that, and I'm not saying that the study is actually doing that, but there's this infantilization of knowledge that's birthed from the global South that we really need to engage with that idea, right? So what I'm trying to push us to think through is, can we actually locate South Africa as an interlocutor in the global discussion on social policy, on these massive transformations that are taking place, and not only as as a country that positions itself to borrow ideas from different parts of the world and then implement in this specific territory, right? I think given our complex history and an interesting social laboratory that South Africa is, we can actually look at the policy experimentations and the failures or lack thereof through the lens of the gift theory, right? That the country can actually be positioned as a pioneering thinker in these discourses that are seemingly challenging the wider conceptualization of neoliberal social policy as conceptualized globally. And I think for me, I'm locating that within the history of welfare itself, right? So if we follow through what has happened, like the historical sociology of how certain European countries moved or changed or allowed for their massive societal transformation when ancien regimes were actually much more prominent. I mean, one can actually look at the case of Bismarck's Germany and like trying to appease the working class, etc., and then moving again, those ideas being taken to the United Kingdom, that this, the so-called rudimentary emergencies of the welfare state in Western Europe. But one can actually locate South Africa in that equation, right? Because it's just soon after colonial Britain enacts segregationist social policies in South Africa in the 1920s, as Jeremy Siggins has actually suggested, that South Africa becomes pretty much like one of the first countries that is looking at this question of social welfare or social policies, albeit just positioned in a segregationist way. And over and above that, we see like the 1929 Carnegie report that pretty much focuses on the poor white problem as a progenitor to these racist policies or racist conceptualization of public policy that has pretty much informed the histories of dispossession and colonial violence that we continue to still deal with them. So if we locate the country in that lens, then we see that some of the ideas that we're engaging with, they're not necessarily new. It's just like a continuation of the old and trying to make sense of the present. And I think we need to make sure that the narrative of South Africa is inserted in that dialogue or discourse, that it's not always about infantilizing or learning, as much as there is, dimensions that one need to pick on in the other spaces. But let's move or shift the debate to this positionality of the country as a place of where knowledge on welfare is actually emerging. And the basic income grant goes to way back to what some sociologists had started writing about, like in the early 2000s, Webster, Siggins, and even Patrick Bond, a whole lot of people that had actually written on this. So I think we can build, critique, depart from some of these things that have actually been suggested already. And just another third point that I want to bring up is also that if we're engaging with the idea of the universal basic income grant, that I think we also need to engage with how justice, international justice, has actually been set up, right? And I think moving forward on that point, there's two things that we need to note. A is that we cannot abstract or decouple the discussion on the universal income grant with how the economy itself has actually been set up or organized, like the institutional arrangements that have actually produced these massive inequalities, right? So in that sense, I think when we're agitating for these ideas around like massive transformation, we also need to account for how the whole world has actually been, it functions in these polarities, but at the very same time, over the past 500 years, the whole world has actually been connected by virtue of this racist capitalist economy that hierarchizes race and gender and nations, and in doing so, when we're thinking about like the labor implications, right? We shouldn't be, especially this is much more true when one talks about the minimum wage. Like you may find that, or so folk in Ontario or in Namibia and South Africa, we have like these differential approaches to our income, right? And yet the way the world capitalism has actually functioned is to homogenize labor. And yet in that homogenization, or the practices that are embedded in it, some people are worth having more, others are worth having less. I think we need to agitate for these like a labor base in which these unequal patterns of stratification, especially when it comes to compensation, are somehow centralized, like at a global level, right? Which the country actually, we're doing this research in comparative terms. I think, and I think this talks to even to some of the observations that I've made in my own research, that we were actually told that there was this Brazil miracle that was actually taking place, and I went to actually challenge some of those assumptions and to make sense of the differential justice that has actually emerged. And just to that is that one of the things that actually explains differential justice is how the Namibian genocide has been handled in terms of compensation by the German government, right? That you had.
Dr. Phiri, sorry to chime in. You have run out of time, so we would really appreciate if you could start wrapping up. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Maybe let me go to the last one, and is that to the fourth point. I think we need a critique of the concept of food security. Those in the observations, what had actually been suggested was that there's this link of the disbursement of the universal grant with hello. We're
here still.
Okay. Yeah, so I think if we could actually problematize food security itself as a concept and maybe start to move towards the understanding of what, food sovereignty, which most folk that are on the critical side have actually advocated for as a metrics that we can actually use when we're linking universal income, not to food security, which has lots of limitations, but rather food sovereignty. So yeah, those are my observations, and would be happy to hear from you, Nkululeko. Thank you. Sorry I took long.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Delgado and Dr. Phiri, for those very thought-provoking questions and comments. So I'll just take a bit of time just to respond to the both of you, and we can open up the Q&A session to all the participants. Okay, so to address you, Guillermo, I think your first question was, which big is more appropriate for South Africa in terms of that demarcation of universal, conditional, and so on. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that means testing is quite an expensive exercise. So, and it's much simpler to implement a universal BIG in South Africa. And given also the efficacy of our social security agency, SASSA, it would be much simpler for us to implement a universal BIG and use the tax system then to recoup the money that goes to those that probably do not need much assistance in terms of a BIG. And yes, in terms of advancing the agenda for the BIG, we need, from the research, we need to now go into the advocacy work that needs to go into this. And we need, I believe, especially the support of youth. So we need to find ways of effectively communicating our research findings with the general public in South Africa and get much more support for the BIG and put government essentially under pressure to implement a BIG. And yeah, we cannot argue or we cannot make a case for a BIG as perhaps a panacea for South Africa, for all of South Africa's socio-economic problems. But I believe it is the starting place that can make an immediate impact in terms of making that dent on poverty and inequality in our country. We still have to support that implementation of a BIG, or once it's implemented, we have to augment augmented with other things such as skills development. South Africa, or South Africans, especially the youth, lack critical skills, for the economy that we're in. And we have to support our young people to get those skills. And to come to some of your comments, Madalito. Unfortunately, for the lack of time, I will not go through everything, but especially I appreciate, because your comments were more conceptual and philosophical around this whole issue of a BIG and how social protection as a concept also needs to be problematized. And what I can say towards that is that a BIG is only one element of a comprehensive social security, and we we basically do need to appreciate the work of people such as Jimmy Adesina and also Thandika Gandawire in terms of broadening the understanding of what social policy should look like in Africa, and the fact that it should include production and also the redistribution of the means of production as critical elements to foster social cohesion and nation building. And as well, of course, you're also correct on the issue of South Africa being an authentic interlocutor on global issues around social policy. You know, as also a decolonial scholar, I do very much appreciate your sentiments of arguing that South Africa cannot just borrow concepts from the global north or borrow policies from the global north and implement in our country. We need to learn from fellow countries in the global south whose conditions are similar to ours. We also need to take into consideration our own challenges and come up with that endogenic kind of solutions towards alleviating or eradicating poverty and inequality. So, yeah, so on that issue, the connectedness of the issue of a BIG and also the economic setup of South Africa is very much important. And that's why I think our next work with SPI, which will be in collaboration with PLUS, is to also link the issue of a BIG with the need for the redistribution of land. And so that speaks to this issue that you raise of the connection between a BIG and the economic setup of South Africa. I'll end there for now. And then I will ask Snetemba to open the floor for the Q&A session. Thanks, Snetemba.
Okay, thank you, Mobile. Thank you for all the panelists for their robust discussion. This is a reminder that this webinar is being streamed live on SPI's social media platforms. There's a hashtag basic income grant if you'd like to tweet about it or to just track the discussion. It's also on Facebook and SPI's websites. So I'll now hand over to Dr. Mobile Zulu, who will facilitate the question and answer session. Thanks.
Thank you, Snetemba, and thank you to the participants. Thanks to Nkululeko for his paper and for the respondents. On the question, we have two questions there. The first question asks, was there any observable differences when the BIG was targeted at households versus those targeted at individuals? I think I'll throw this one to you, Nkululeko, as the presenter. I'm sure, Delgado, you having done research in Namibia, maybe you might also want to tackle this one. So I'm opening that up to you too. Then there's a second question. Why have these pilots not led to permanent big universal BIG programs? That's the second question. So, Nkululeko and Delgado, I'll skip you on this one, Comrade Dalitso. Thank you. So, Nkululeko first, Delgado second. Please respond.
All right. Thanks, Doc. So in terms of the issue of targetedness, you will have noticed from the presentation, most of the pilots that we looked at which were targeted are the global north, are the pilots in the global north. And the underlying assumption there, or what we found, especially with the Canadian BIG pilot, was that it was stopped in its tracks before it was stopped before it could go through the full period planned period for the BIG. And that matter was political. But it was stopped at a phase whereby at least there was now a report or preliminary report on findings. And it was stopped basically based on that myth that the BIG wouldn't work and it's only a waste of state resources and so on. So the prevailing neoliberal capitalist notion in developed countries is what has made or is what sort of shaped the BIG pilots in those countries to be targeted. But apart from that, these are countries that enjoy a higher standard of living than countries in the global south. So that's what would account for the targetedness of these pilots.
Yes, on the side of Namibia, and if I understand the question correctly, is between the targeting the household or targeting individuals. In the case of Namibia, the framing was a rights-based approach. So the BIG was seen as a sort of individual right. So it was targeting individuals, and as similarly probably to the case of South Africa, the definition of family is also need to be like the colonized, in the sense that it is not like what probably the statistics might show. In reality or practically, one has often in many instances, a caretaker, perhaps a grandmother, taking care of not a minor number of children. So then in this case, she would receive a concomitant amount to support the household, which in many instances can be quite numerous, especially in rural areas. So in this case of Namibia, this I think was the right approach to respond specifically to the various configurations of households and various definitions also of families in the context of Namibia and probably also South Africa.
Okay, thank you both. There was a question too. Guleba, I think you quite fully answered the first question. The first question you focused on the targeting, but the question focused on targeted individuals and households. I think there's a difference there, because that then in a sense speaks to what the child grant, the distressed grant is sort of help in. So that's the debate I think currently that's going on, whether we support individuals or we support households and how much that costs. But moving on to the second question. The second question was, why have these pilots not led to permanent BIG programs, Universal Basic Income Grant programs? Do you want to take that to the both of you? And thank you, Delgado, for sharing the Namibian experience.
I think also with the second question, I answered it tentatively with my response to the first question. It's all politics, really. With the Namibian case, there was no traction because of political resistance to the idea of a BIG. And that's why up until now, it hasn't translated into a permanent universal BIG program. I think in Kenya, there's still another pilot that is ongoing. So we still haven't seen that also translating into a permanent BIG program. But as I had alluded, in Canada, the political resistance to a BIG is what stopped the pilot in its tracks, in fact. But in the US, what you find with the federal system is that in a number of states, is that there are BIG programs in those states. And the one in Stockton, I think, is still ongoing as a permanent program. I'll hand over to you now, Guillermo.
No, I don't have any. I mean, I think that I addressed it in the previous, at least the individual and the household difference.
Okay, thank you. Another, this one is from Facebook. Thank you to our Facebook viewers. Somebody says the problem is that BIG critics say that BIG is unaffordable and does not add value to the economy. How do we tackle that? So the question then focuses on the affordability of BIG and the issue of adding value to the economy. Delgado, I want to start with you.
Well, no, the evidence from Namibia, it's actually not true. I mean, I think it's more the conceptualization of such a grant, either as an expenditure or as an investment. And I think that has to do with, I suppose, political economic paradigm in a given society at that time. I suppose that as I wrote in one report that we also did for a SPY specifically focused on Namibia, at the moment is fairly divided. Whereas, for example, civil society is very much convinced and advocates that this is an investment, which actually coincides with some of the findings of the Namibian pilot. There are some sectors in the government that sees it as an expenditure, and they also don't see it as social protection as the primary way to develop economically a country. I think they also they're convinced that there may be other measures like employment creation, education, industrialization, or whichever other means. And I think that and so in that context, then indeed the basic income grant appears more as an additional expenditure without considering the multipliers and the other effects that are in fact well documented. So I think in this case, despite the available data, I think the influence that the political economic paradigm of a given country at a given time has very much to do on whether it is actually viewed as an expenditure or as an investment.
If I may add to that, Doc, I think we also saw with Duma's presentation last week, and also with a number of proposals from fellow research institutions, that what critics argue when they say the BIG is unaffordable is not based on any empirical evidence. I mean, there's a number of proposals available in terms of how to fund a sustainable BIG in South Africa. And if I can pick up one point from Duma's presentation last week, if we were to go for the option of borrowing in order to fund the BIG, from the calculations coming from his paper, in terms of the GDP debt ratio, there wouldn't be any significant increase in terms of that. So it's then quite misleading to argue that the BIG is unaffordable. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Khululeko. Thank you both. I'll give 1 minute each now to our presenters. I'll start with you, Dr. Phiri. Just 1 minute to round off. Any last words that you have to say? Dr. Phiri first, then Dr. Delgado second, and lastly, Khululeko. Sinatemba, if you have something to say, you can say it after Khululeko. Thank you.
Sorry, sorry to interrupt, Dr. Zulu, but can I skip the line and be first, because I really need to leave in a couple minutes. Yes.
Okay, please. You got it.
Look, I think this, as I said, this is a very valuable contribution to a topic of great social relevance in Southern Africa and in the world, as we have seen. I think I emphasize a little bit more in the particular case of Southern Africa, or even Sub-Saharan Africa, where we see that most of those living in the continent now find themselves in an urban area, and most of them find themselves living in an informal settlement. And those figures that we have indicate that most of those having a livelihood in these urban areas find themselves in the informal sector. So in this case, speaking about, in this particular case, speaking about measures for social protection and to encourage improvement in living conditions, I think BIG comes quite handy in the sense that it is easy to implement and it actually triggers entrepreneurial activity, independence, and decreases reliance on state support, which is actually quite important. And I just read yesterday a submission from the Legal Assistance Center here in Namibia on the issue of reproductive rights and on women's reproductive rights. Right now, there's a very kind of a heated debate on the legalization of abortion in Namibia. And one of the recommendations was, in fact, the implementation of a basic income grant in a submission about reproductive rights. So this, I think, speaks a little bit about how other kind of struggles see the benefit of how such a measure can have, even in the debates pertaining women's bodies and body autonomy. So I think that's, those are my contributions, and congratulations again. And I hope you have a fruitful kind of wrapping up of this event. And thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Dr. Delgado. Thank you for your participation. Dr. Phiri, your minute, please.
Just a quick one on my side. It's just to say that I think the more we think about the Universal Basic Income Grant, we need to remember that targeting is an idea that is defunct, and we should always push for universal benefits in a society that is, or agitate for ideas around decommodified social provisioning. I think that's important. Implementing the Universal Basic Income Grant goes hand in hand with the restructuring or a radical transformation of the economy, not in terms of how other political forces or social forces have conceptualized, but rather in a way that puts the poor and working class communities at the center of social imagination. We should always remember that over and above the income guarantees that a state can actually bring, there's also the dimension in which we're dealing with a highly hierarchical, racist neoliberal globalization that continues to push for the commodification of water, of land, of housing, of education, of pension, so much that some of the gains that can actually be made are lost within this project of commodification.
Thank you, Dr. Phiri. Sinetemba, last words.
Nothing from me, Dr. Phiri. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for such an engaging webinar. I look forward to the next one in 2 days. Thanks.
Thank you, Sinetemba. That was Dr. Zulu inviting you to speak. Okay, Dr. Phiri was the last one to speak up before you. Khululeko, please. 1 minute.
Thanks, Doc. I won't even use the minutes. I'll just use a few seconds to thank my respondents and also thank everyone who's made the time to join us for this afternoon's webinar. It's truly appreciated. And just to say that now the work goes to the advocacy. We've done the research, it's there, and it's important now to get the people on the ground behind us. Thank you.
Thank you. Nkululeko, do you want to give a note on the next webinar to look out for?
So in terms of the next webinar, we've had to postpone the next webinar to, I think, the 3rd week in November, but we will communicate shortly regarding that postponement. Yeah.
I think the multiplier impact and effects are multiplying for the author.
Thank you for sharing that, Isabel. Just to thank the SPI team. Thank you, Nkululeko. And Nolo, I saw you was part of the audience for this paper. Thank you to Delgado, to Dr. Piri, to Snetemba for helping to facilitate this. But also a large thanks to the SPI team, Lady K, Mpo, Tina, Nikela, Duduzo, all of you guys on deck, and thank you to Isabel. And thank you to the participants and the people that have come in and joined us either via Facebook or via Zoom. We thank you. Please look at our website. We'll be posting the report. I think it has been posted, this report that Nkululeko just shared. We'll be posting the report that Tuma did, the first one, and the second one on multipliers will also be posted on our website. Please watch our website, watch our messaging. There'll be the last webinar. We'll let you know. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.